Hey there, know-it-alls. It is your friend, Professor Know-it-all. I'm here with all the news that you have to hear about Star Trek, and this week's episode of Brave New Worlds, Episode 3, is definitely one to remember. The episode's called Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow, and specifically, it features, well, hot on the heels of last week, where the traitor Una Chin Riley was put on trial. An alien trying to impersonate a human for so long. One of the best courtroom procedurals I think I've ever seen, especially when they indicted not only her, but ultimately protecting the best interests of the United Earth Fleet, as well as Earth itself. Well, Earth such as it is, because obviously, I mean, if you're a fan of the original series, then you obviously know about Earth and its poor, untimely demise and how it's been. But anyways, they're not going to retcon that. I know that much. So anyway, so the episode essentially focuses on Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise, and specifically they encounter a Vulcan ship with Captain Spock, a Vulcan commander who is seeking help. I mean, I guess they think we're foolish or whatever, but it's pretty interesting. And ultimately he's asking for help because the Romulans are about to beat them, and I'm like, well, of course the Romulans are about to beat you guys. And Kirk unfortunately can't help. That's when this unknown girl, claiming to come from something called Starfleet, she has an almost identical uniform to all the ones that we know, but she claims that there has been a change in the timeline. So we're going to get into all that in just a bit. So, all right, y'all, stick around, because here we come with our review of Brave New Worlds, Episode 3, Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow. What's up, my know-it-alls? Okay, obviously having a little bit of fun, but that's the kind of hijinks we got this week on this really great, cool time travel episode. Now, of course, La'an, who is the head of security, you can start with the episode with her, from her perspective, and what you see is she's kind of getting bored, a little humdrum with everything. Not to mention the fact that she's still reeling from last week, where it was revealed, at least privately, to the attorney who helped defend Una, Nira, that she has some of the markers that made up Khan Noonien Singh within her. So therefore, she's got some of those modified genes, and she's kind of still learning. And we find out that she didn't go to the celebration dinner when she's having this really great exercise match with Mbenga, and ultimately what leads to a fairly interesting encounter before she's walking through the halls. Ultimately, we get to that scene that you all saw in the clip last week when they dropped the clip promoting this week's episode, where she encounters a guy in a suit, and he's got blood. And he opens up his little hologram thingy, and he's looking at it, and it's very clearly a hologram of what looks like time travel stuff. Now, if this kind of time travel stuff looks familiar to you, that's because you saw it here originally. That over here in Voyager, back in the day when they had time travel. So there's a time agency that hasn't been created yet, but ultimately that's what they are going to say is the brand new encounter. You'll get to it. Hang on. Let me not get ahead of myself. So after she talks to the guy, he has this device, and the device itself has a little thing, and he sets it for a certain time frame, and he tells her, you got to get to the bridge. And so she assumes it's the bridge. Well, when he dies, he suddenly transforms, or not teleports, fades away. And the entire ship in a flash changes. Lon runs up to the bridge, only to encounter it's not Pike anymore, it's Kirk, Captain. Different symbol. Same thing with all the other people in the crew. Ortega's still there, but there's Spock is nowhere to be seen. Neither is Una, and it's one of those moments where you're like, okay, and that's when you get that moment that I was in from the alternate universe, where it's the first time we've seen an alternate universe or alternate timeline, at least since Picard. But we're not talking about Picard season 2. But at the same time, it's different than an alternate timeline like Mirror Mirror. So I really dug this peek into another world, and this was a very different world. You find out in this episode that this is a world where certain things didn't have changed, and humanity essentially we wore out the planet, but not the Federation isn't happen, but the United Earth Fleet does happen. So as they're trying to talk briefly, she's like, there's this moment where you see that Spock is a captain in the Vulcan Empire, and apparently the Vulcans are at war with the Romulans, and the Romulans are also at war with the humans. Everybody seems to be having very unfriendly relationships with one another. It's a very xenophobic era, not very Starfleet at all, because this isn't Starfleet. So what happens is she says to Lon says, maybe can we talk in private? And when they talk, she goes for broke and explains the whole thing, and he's like, you want me to believe this? Blah blah blah. And so he goes to look at the device, and she accidentally, while trying to wrestle it back, activates it. They go back in time. When they're back in time, they're in, relatively speaking, the present. This is probably one of the best explanations that I can really, really see, because they do a wonderful thing, and they address the fact that in the original series canon, 1992 is when the eugenics wars are supposed to happen. They meet a young lady who's a kind of photographer, and they're tracking what's going. They're trying to find out what's different. There's these really fun encounters and whatnot, where it's the one you saw again from the clip where Kirk's like, I work in space and this and that, and because this Kirk is very different from the Kirk we know. This Kirk was born on the USS Iowa. Because apparently mankind, when they went to the stars, they've populated Mars and the Moon and some other places. Earth itself is a husk, and so a lot of people live in space and are born, and that's what happens. And so they try to figure out what's going on. They're starting to drop hints of chemistry between the two of them, and you get this moment where he basically looks at her and is like, hey, listen, I might have missed a few temporal mechanics classes, but as far as I know, I just got to sit back and chill. I enjoy me some hot dogs, relax, because at the end of the day, you're asking me to help erase my universe. I mean, he's not wrong. He's totally not wrong. So when she begins explaining certain things about how things are, he comes to the realization that, hey, maybe her universe is a little better than ours. And so what happens is they encounter their first hiccup. First off, they're in Canada, which, by the way, big ups to Canada, because literally these are the same sets and buildings we saw in Supergirl and The Flash. I know because there's a couple set pieces in this where I clearly remember having seen them play at these locations, because they're interesting locations. So the fact that they're actually in Canada and they say as much, I think is pretty cool. So as they progress forward, there's this explosion in this giant bridge, and according to their memories, both of them, the explosion's supposed to happen. What isn't supposed to happen is what Kirk remembers. Because the girl with the camera who they run into, she talks about a fusion reactor that's underneath it. She's total conspiracy theory nut. And they're kind of like, it's funny, they look at her with pity, like, oh, well, it's sad that she's so close, yet so far. And ultimately what happens is, Kirk's like, he does remember, he's like, there is a fusion bomb here. In his timeline, the fusion bomb goes off. And now we're getting somewhere. So they realize they have to track it down. In the very, very beginning of the episode, we had a brief moment from Pelia where she is sort of, I guess they have recovered these antiques, and they marked antiques from the archaeology department. And she's like, oh yeah, no, I still have a cache of things in my home in Vermont where I used to live. So she drops some hints. It's the classic story trope where you're like, we're going to drop his hint. It's going to be important later. Because they basically pull a Guinan. And by that I mean, and those of you who watch Star Trek, you know what I'm talking about, where you have her going back, when they go back in time, of course, the only option is to how do you find someone? So immediately Lon's like, I know an engineer who lives here, let's go to Vermont. And they travel to Vermont and they talk to Pelia, only find out she's not an engineer yet. In fact, a lot of what Lon does may very well key her into becoming a potential engineer in the future. Now, the one thing they don't necessarily tell us is later on, and you do get, there's a look that they share later that may or may not have been sort of recognition, hence the whole Guinan aspect, where she's like in the past and she's really old, whatever. But they end up getting a watch that it's this really loose, let's throw it away science, and I'm okay with that. But they essentially have a watch. It's got this radiation type stuff that when present will glow. And so, and I'm like, okay, a little hand wavy, but I'm down. And so what happens is they end up tracking where this fusion thing is. They get to a place. It's the Noonien Singh Institute. They're at the birthplace of the eugenics wars. Now, if you watched Picard Season 2 and you understand the whole relationship between the Sung and later on the Files, there's always been this confusion. We're in 2023. Clearly, the eugenics wars never happened. So how do you reconcile that with old-style sci-fi? They never tried. What they did is they always explained it. Yet Voyager had an episode, a few different time travel episodes throughout have tried to sort of subtly explain it. This episode gives us the single best example of what this whole thing is about. In essence, the girl who with the camera, she sees La'an. After La'an sees the Noonien Singh thing, La'an puts her hand on this door pad because it scans the biometric scan. Biometric scan registers her as Noonien Singh DNA and opens up for her. The girl with the camera before is a time-traveling Romulan agent who's been there for 30 years. Effectively putting her in 1992, 1993 area. Her job has been to stop and push back when the eugenics wars happens. Hence now why we haven't gotten, why that's, at least that's the explanation. I'm totally digging it and I'm down. And her point is that we need that dark time of the eugenics wars, the dark ages of the eugenics wars, in order for humanity to eventually usher in the utopia that is the Federation. So she didn't show up to cause the fusion reaction explosion. She showed up to kill Baby Khan. And sure enough, what do we see when they go through the doorway? A door literally marked Khan. It's it's cool, and I was a big fan. I thought they did this very, very well. And so what is the choices she's gonna make? And even the Romulan agent's like, what are you gonna do? He's the worst killer, this and that. And La'an says, well, yeah, he's got my ancestors' legacy is genocide and torture and murder, all these horrible things. And she goes, and me. I had said, as she said, and me, I said, and the Federation. Because the truth is, much like the Roman Empire, which led to the Middle Dark Ages, which eventually leads to civilized industrial age, you need the dark times of the eugenics wars to eventually usher in a brighter era in terms of the Earth being tired and fed up, want utopia. That's what you want. So she decides to go ahead and say, by the way, Kirk dies. Yeah, the chick is like, I'm going to shoot you, this and that. And he's like, well, it's going to set off the alarm. She goes, you might be bluffing. He's like, no, I'm not. Prove me wrong. And she shoots him and kills him. So La'an's ticked off. So the girl forces La'an to go through the thing. She talks her through. La'an decides, I am not going to do that. She turns around and she begins to fight. And she fights hard. And eventually the chickie, having lost to the Romulan agent, loses. And she pushes this suicide button on her neck that makes her disintegrate. And La'an meets a young Khan. He says, are you here to kill me? And she says, no. And she wipes the Romulan blood off of him from when she got shot, when the Romulan agent was shot. And then as the guards are finally coming, she activates the little light on the device from the future time traveler guy, turns from red to green. She pushes it, returns back to her own time. She immediately rushes up to the bridge. There's Pike, there's Una, there's Pelia, and that's when he's like, what is this other thing? And she says, well, we can let this one slide or whatever else. And Pelia kind of gives her a look. That's that look, that Guinan-y look I was saying, where she's like, okay. But then she goes back to her quarters and she immediately makes a phone call. She calls Lieutenant Kirk. And she finds any excuse, and as soon as she gets off with him, and they joke and flirt a little bit, she makes some excuse about wanting to get some information about Sam's file and whatnot, his brother. And she immediately bursts into tears because he's alive. So I hope that's proof that there's going to be some sort of relationship with the future. I think it'd be really cool to see that. But yeah, man, love to hear what you guys think. So there you go. Now you know. And if knowing is half the battle, you're halfway to being a know-it-all yourself. So what's the know-it-all index rating for this episode, episode 3, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow? I'm going to give this episode a very strong 8. I thought it was a good episode. I like the time travel shenanigans. I like the fact that we kind of get to see... They keep giving us dabblings of Kirk, but it's never the real him. And I'm like, bro, just assign him to the Enterprise and be done. Why are we having this exchange? The other thing that occurred to me is, how come everybody knows about Khan? Like, I get it. But in Space Seed, he was supposed to be, yes, a historical figure, but I don't know. It's one of those inconsistencies that sort of sits with me weird sometimes. But either way, we'd love to hear your thoughts and comments. Do me a favor, subscribe to the channel. It helps the algorithm, helps us be able to get more views, and helps people be able to find our channel when they know that other people are enjoying it. But yeah, man, that's it for this week. Never forget. Well, that's it for this week, guys. The professor has closed up shop. And if you have any more questions, hey, comment below and let me know. But at the end of the day, don't worry about a thing. As long as you're a know-it-all, everyone knows you know it all.